I think the time is 11, so we can start now. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarika Chakravarti. I work at the NIUA since last 7 years in varying capacities. I'll be the moderator of this session on reinventing frameworks for urban governance and planning under the U20 Manthan. This is the 5th Manthan that we are organizing. Reinventing frameworks for urban governance and planning is one of the 6 priority areas identified as critical for inspiring city-level actions to respond to these global agendas. U20 is one of the 11 engagement groups under the G20 presidency that India is hosting this year. The theme of G20 is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, one earth, one family, one future, symbolizing a pro-planet approach and growth amidst challenges. U20, like I said, is one of the engagement groups and is an opportunity to demonstrate that policies and practices adopted by cities have powerful implications to achieve global agendas of sustainable development. Today's discussion will revolve around 3 sub-themes. The first one being creating frameworks for urban governance that respond to the emerging urban patterns. The second one is shift from regulatory to strategic urban planning. And the third one being facilitating urban regeneration in our existing areas. We have with us a very distinguished group of experts. I'll briefly introduce them. Mr. Hitesh Vaidya, Director of National Institute of Urban Affairs, a knowledge think tank under the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, Government of India. We also have Dr. Sridharan, who is the former Director of SPA Bhopal, Vijayawada, and Additional Director, SPA New Delhi. And we have with us Ms. Rajit Matthews, the Program Director, Urban Development at WRI India, and also Mr. Oscar Chamath. Oscar, I hope I got your name correctly, the Research and Policy Officer at Metropolis. In the Manthan today, we will be posing questions to our experts regarding the sub-themes that I've introduced before. I request the experts to limit their responses to 5 minutes per question. This will be followed by a question and answer session where the experts will respond to the questions that we receive from the audience. The audience is requested to use the chat box for sending in their queries. Before we begin, I kindly request all the panelists to switch on their videos and so that we can have a group photo. And I've been told by my colleagues who are supporting me in organizing this Manthan, Saryu, Kapil, and Nimisha, that this is really important and this is forgotten in the past Manthans that we've organized. So just quickly a group photo. Please let me know when we are done. Thank you. So let's set the ball rolling. We are all aware that our cities are facing unprecedented urbanization and their growth is impacted by the equation that they share with their surrounding areas. Some of these factors are the emerging economic linkages, differential land costs, enhanced connectivity, and so on. So essentially, a city is no longer just a city, but also part of a larger ecosystem with strong interdependencies. The new spatial patterns of urban growth, such as economic corridors, to name a few, the Greater Mekong subregion, Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor, Asian Highway, the Grand Paris, etc., and conurbations such as the National Capital Region of Delhi, Greater London, Tokyo, etc., and mega regions. We have examples of Paris, Amsterdam, Brussels, and Munich, Seoul and Busan, London, Leeds, and Manchester. These can be seen world over, and there is a demand for innovation in governance frameworks to maximize their investments to boost economic metrics such as GDP, which in turn improve the livability standard of the city. With this background, my first question is to Mr. Vaidya. So you have more than 20 years of experience in the urban development sector, which literally translates to witnessing 2 decades of global and Indian cities evolving. Based on your experience, how do you think should our urban governance structures respond to the demands of the emerging new spatial patterns? And what kind of a legislative framework is required to foster regional and cluster planning approaches and implementation of collaborative governance frameworks? Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Sarika, for having me here, and thank you all the panelists of joining this Manthan. I see a lot of experts here, so I'll restrict myself to a very you talked about a lot of issues on GDP, regional economy, and I'll not get into that. I'm saying what happens during COVID. 2 years of COVID, we were on our same computer screens and we were shouting, not like Arnab Goswami, a nation want to answer, but we were all talking about our planning instruments need to change. We were all talking about that we need to have more focus on non-rise transport system. We were all talking about green-blue infrastructure. We were all talking about it's a local area plan or a neighborhood planning is important. Now that 2 years are over, we are back to the square one. How do you really move forward to really doing an ad hoc approach of, speaking something, but actually now really aligning our thinking to that new way we want this, whatever we wanted to do. So I will get into this. First thing we talked about during the COVID is that our public health and our physical planning need to be talking to each other. Our transport planning, our land use planning need to talk to each other. Our climate issues or climate action plans need to talk about physical planning. And for that to happen, I think the biggest model, which I particularly think, is how do you integrate these different planning instruments? How do they start talking about it? It cannot be just aligning them, but I think we need to come up with that strategy of how do you really talk about that planning instruments, start talking about it. Every city, every state has a number of planning instruments. The question is, even a master plan is a legally only a recognized planning instrument. How does it integrate with others? So that's a challenge which I think we need to really think about. And I don't know whether we have a real answer, but we need to really start now building our thinking that what becomes the a strategic visioning document of a city, and how does it really talk about larger outcomes which city wants, rather than getting into only a land use planning. Second thing which we have realized over a period of time, that if we are talking about net zero and climate action, then climate action really bypasses or goes beyond the jurisdiction of a city. So if these climate actions have to be dealt up at a city level, and the regional planning approaches also need to be thought about. So how do you really want that regional planning to really come? Because we don't have those frameworks of a regional planning very established. We do have, I don't say we don't have, but we don't have a established regional planning frameworks. How do you bring the peri-urban areas into the planning process? What happens? Because as you already said, that we have a Delhi, but we also have a Delhi NCR. How does they interact with each other? What are those mechanisms to really interact the city planning with the larger regional planning networks? This is need to be really thought about. Third thing which I want, we only talk about master plan, which is 20 years plan, and I think our work in master plan of Delhi 2041, which we are doing, has also highlighted this, that our planning process has to be much more strategic and much more dynamic. And how do you really work on it? Because the urbanization is changing quite fast, and one single instrument which really decides 20 years journey may not happen. So we need to really come up with a very dynamic thing. And I think having said that, we need to have some kind of scale issue to be really thought of. Whether we want for a local area, we need to have a neighborhood planning, but for a regional planning, we have to have a, for a larger areas or economic development, we might have to go to regional planning. And I think it should be like a Google map. How do you zoom in? How do you zoom out? And that is the strategies and tools available to a city officials that they can scale and look at it. Fourth thing which I talked about, and I think again, example from Master Plan of Delhi, I will say that we have 20 years horizon while we are doing a planning, but do we have a financial horizon also in place? How do we link the city finances with the planning instruments? Because your actions and your priorities will depend on what your finances available today. So linkages with this area is much more important. And then we all talk about planning is for the people, but somewhere, how do you involve people in the planning process? While we have attempted this in a master plan of Delhi, it has been very limited. If you look at the scale and percentage of per person really contributes into the discussion is a very limited. And these instruments, this choice has to be, do we want to get into a decentralized planning process, or whether it will be a good mechanism to go with that route, or, you need to come up with the different mechanisms of involving people, has to be really thought through while we are looking at it. And lastly, which I'll stop here because of is on the technology and innovations, because technology is answer. How do you include spatial mapping, spatial data, data analytics to really make those evidence-based planning, which we have to really thought about. And also, we all talk about multi-convergence or multi-level coordination. It's very nice to say, but very difficult to be done. What type of mechanism and institutional forms we need to really come up with this multi-level coordination mechanisms to be really effective on the ground? I think these are the areas where we need to really go back to the drawing table and start thinking about it. But having said that, I think the four areas which we need to really press upon while moving forward onto bringing is, one is scale, one is tenure of this planning process, one is the form, because every city is somebody is a transforming city, somebody is a growing city. How do you bring the culture, the USP of that city into the planning process? And lastly, on your financial mechanisms, as well as the agency who will really deliver this, where does it work? How do citizens get involved? I think these are the issues which we need to really bring into this hybrid models of planning process and governance models, which need to combine both centralized and decentralized decision making and processes. So I think if we move to that direction, we might have to but I think these are the difficult decisions and has to have a lot of political. And I think our Prime Minister has really brought in that we need to really revisit the planning process. And during after his budget speech, he did say that we don't also need to not only think about new cities, but also look at the existing cities and how we really bring them onto that planning model. So that's where I landed here, and let's see how others come back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your insightful response and touching upon multiple aspects, the need for integrated planning, climate actions, strategic planning, city investment plans, and the need for building capacities of our urban local bodies, multi-stakeholder participation, which is very critical. And as we realize that all these topics actually necessitate looking beyond the political and spatial jurisdictions of our cities, and to innovate the extant urban governance structures. With this, my next question is directed to Dr. Sridharan. So institutionalizing the urban governance structures, the need for this has emerged time and again. However, this is a very complex process and can involve passing of a resolution, formulating an act, etc., which are all very time-consuming processes. So can constitution of interim governance typologies, such as the special purpose vehicles, certain committees, etc., be advantageous in planning and managing urban growth and large-scale infrastructure projects? What are the advantages and limitations of such structures? Over to you, sir.
Okay, first, thank you very much, Sarika. First, let me thank NIUA and Hitesh Vaidya for bringing me here, and also the team, Sarika and other members of the Urban Shift Country project. Thank you very much for this. Now, I've been working on this for almost from 1995 onwards on urban governance as well as this. The first and foremost aspect which I'm saying, as you rightly pointed out, which has been discussed by many authors like Richardson, talks about that we start with the assumption that the existing forms of urban governance is not fit for the purpose. Okay, so with that assumption, we are saying that we want something SPV, we want something about that. What we required is some kind of a co-production. What we talk about redesign the urban knowledge architecture and governance system. That's something very important. That's one thing. Now, as rightly pointed out by Mr. Hitesh, and also you raised that issue, the periphery and expanding. What I talk about is a boundary spanning, which has been discussed about scaling up and scaling down by Neil Brunner and others. We all started about it. And the urban model itself has been discussed about so many decades. We have been discussing about Thatcherism, Reaganomics, and market and whatnot. Okay. Now, within that, whether we require SPVs or special purpose vehicle, yes, it is important. They came out, but right from the beginning, our own experiences of SPVs, okay, how to address that issue for the big infrastructure, yes, it is required. But right from the beginning, they had to come out with exit plan because as per the constitutional assurances, 74th Amendment, 73rd Amendment, okay. Why? Because I've been working on this for many years now. And recently, I mean, in 2019 and 2021, we came out with a peri-urban plan also for the rural areas. Okay, including the areas which are within the metropolitan region or the urbanizable areas also, which has been published by the Ministry of Panchayati Raj. Now we are working on Peri-Urban Model Act, okay, which probably by end of June or by August, that will also be published in terms of this one from the Parliament. Now, there we are talking about what is the main problem. You can bring in the SPV or you can come in with the Metropolitan Authority, you can come out with anything. What I think in terms of planning institutions, they come out with the plan, that's all. What about the planning, the land governance? The land governance is not been addressed by any of these issues. Well, we don't have an institution which talks about land governance, which we talk about. I mean, if you go into US, they did ask about the Lincoln Institute, talks about the land governance. IHS talks about the land governance. That's a missing aspect of our planning itself. Now, SPVs, okay, they come out of this particular aspect and then goes into this particular issue of infrastructure development. But land development in terms of spatial planning, that's not even organized, or you can, what do you say? It's organized in terms of planning, but in terms of monitoring it and then implementing it overall, the governing system doesn't exist for that. Like, I'll give you a small example of the ADB's 2023, as well as which came up from 2018 onwards. They have been writing on this. Okay, they talk about the cluster cities. Out of the 29 Asian cities which they discussed about, 7 of them are in India. The latest one to come, which was surprised when I was going into the detail, is Agra and Aligarh. Okay, it is in the dynamics of economic dynamics that comes out in terms of this cluster, the economic engines that driving the forces. Now, one system cannot do that. Even in the case of Noida, so now they came out with the Greater Noida, and now it goes beyond that in terms of the surrounding areas of the international airport area. So it keeps on, we cannot keep on institutions after institutions, which as the contestation each other. Okay, that is something very, very important of it. So the act is there in existence. Only thing is in terms of implementing the proper thing. What we require is not the SPVs, but what we require is a spatial organization or the spatial ministry, which goes into the land governance. That is something very, very important. Under which the SPVs can be done for a particular purpose. Okay, it's not necessary that SPVs are most successful. So they also talk about addressing the issue of boundary spanning, the scale issues. Okay, we need to be cautious in creating the new institutions further, because that's the in the case of India, that's what is important. Because when you take them out, in the case of Delhi also, when the new governance model came up in 1997, 96, 97, with the RWAs, and also in Mumbai, okay, with the RWAs, how to put it as a part of the model of governance. It also came up with that. After that, it existed. Okay, it never exited. I mean, they exited rather. It never continues. They're not able to sustain. Now, if we had it, as rightly pointed out by Mr. Hitesh also, this is a good opportunity which has been brought to us through G20, also through your institution U20. Okay, this is a good opportunity through the SDG, especially through SDG level, where we can organize, we can integrate all these instruments, right from water to climate change to pollution to everything. We can bring it together. In fact, I did wrote something on the note on this in terms of SDG 11, how to do that at the global level in terms of local self-governance. That's something important. We have many cases where we can also give a quote. Probably the next round I will do that. Thank you very much. That's all.
Thank you, Dr. Sridharan, for your very pertinent input. The takeaways have been that all SPVs or these interim governance structures should have an exit plan. And we do need to add spatiality to all these things, and perhaps a governance structure, perhaps in form of a ministry, which looks exclusively at land management and governance in our cities. That's required, and also addresses the issues of boundary spanning, etc. And you also emphasized on multi-sectoral integration, which is again a very important aspect that we need to consider while we are planning our cities. Also, something that will for which integrated urban governance is highly required. My next question, I would like to bring in Oscar. Oscar, my question to you is about the participation of multiple stakeholders. Urban governance is influenced by the creation and operation of political institutions, as we all understand, government capacity to make and implement decisions, and also the extent to which these decisions recognize and respond to the interests of the poor. The most vulnerable are often excluded and ignored in the decision-making processes. There are large gaps between the poor and the better off urban residents, their access to social, economic, and political opportunities, and in their ability to participate in and leverage the benefits of urban living. How can the participation of stakeholders, irrespective of their gender, age, class, or physical ability, be mainstreamed in participatory planning models? Over to you, Oscar.
Thank you, Sarika. I'm happy to be here. Good morning from Barcelona. I'm really happy to join you, because I think that India is one of the places that are more interesting to analyze the urban phenomena. I think that is what is happening there is a unique opportunity. I'm learning, and what is more interesting is that I'm learning from you that there are some similar challenges around the world, and one is participation. I mean, this is not a matter only of India, but it's a matter of it's a global challenge that we are living in an urban world, but we are having problems to bring people together. And this is something that for us, I work in Metropolis, the Global Association of Metropolitan Areas and Major Cities, is a network of almost 150 cities of at least 1 million people. That I know that is not big for an India reality, but all kinds of cities and big cities around the world. We have almost 150 cities. And something that we find is the same question. The most difficult question in all panels is how to bring people to the participatory process. And one of the theories that we are working on right now comes from a project that I was part of during the last 3 years. We have been working with the London School of Economics and UCLG in analyzing what is happening when an emergency appears, a complex emergency such as the governance, such as COVID, housing, or things that really change the way that we perceive the cities. And something that we realize is that definitely we have the tools. We have the tools. I am an engineer, and the engineers love the tools. We love the Hammer, we love the Excel, we love these kind of platforms. But we are missing something in the planning process, that is critical, that is what is really matters for the people, what is their key issue for them. Because sometimes what we have found in all the cities is that all we need for the city planning is to have the tools, the procedures, and we think that if we put there our ideas that are absolutely legitimate, you know what I mean, is not enough to go further in the output process. So you asked me about how to bring poor and the better of people. I think that probably this is one of the things that we need to change around the world, that this is not a problem about the poor and the better of. It's a matter of what moves the people. And we have found in the recent years, especially after the COVID, as the first speaker said, the COVID changed the way that we perceive the cities. I live in Barcelona, a very noisy and a very amazing city. And we have found that the silence in our cities is important. We find that the public space is relevant. And what brings us all this is that the most important thing at this moment in all the cities seems to be something that as simple as important as the care. Understanding that care is not only about health, it's not only about public transport, it's about how can we design the city to facilitate the people that can go and buy the bread, bring the kids to the school in a very easy and cheap way. If we introduce this concept into the planning process, the tools that we already have, and the flexibility that they have, we can have some output that is different that we have been getting through the last decades, I would say. So it's important to understand for us, from our perspective, is that caring, that is not a tangible and not a thing that we are used to do, is important to introduce into the planning process. Why care? Because it's what people really feels in every day. And to understand, and if we go to the people as policymakers or to the people and say, okay, let's try to change this street, let's try to change this whole neighborhood, and let's try to bring and ask them, how can we change this? Probably the people will interact more because it's something that they really are interested to. So this is not a magical, this is not, I mean, all the cities around the world have exactly the same problem, how to bring the people, how to bring diversity into the planning process. But probably we have been trying with the same tools, expecting to have different results. We are changing the tools, but probably we are not changing the question that we need to share with the people. At operative level, what it means, okay, let's try to introduce the technological side, but it's not enough. Let's try to introduce a door-to-door, knocking to the door, hey, let me give me your answer. It's not enough. But it's a mix of all of them that make that the people, that is what is important at the end, can be introduced into this. So another level that is important is that city planners, city institutions, city stakeholders needs to understand that the city is not only about a matter of wealth. It's not about the money. It goes beyond that. And it's important that we work for this. I'm not talking about, okay, let's forget about the business, let's forget about the economic development, because if we want to have sustainable cities and caring cities, we need money. I mean, forget it. I mean, we need money to do all this, and we need economic development. But probably if we change the equation and we introduce another elements of the planning process, probably everything will change. So as a conclusion, I would say it's not a matter of poor and better off. It's a matter of what is join all these people. And probably one of our theories that is being contrasted so far is caring in the broader sense. Caring as a center of the planning process probably will change the way that we use the already existing tools. Because as the first or second speaker said, we are probably not living in cities. We are living right now in an urban phenomena that has different names. economic corridors, we call it in metropolis and big areas, and all these kind of things need an absolutely different perspective on how we tackle those challenges. So I stop here because I would like to continue talking. Thank you so much. I hope to see you again.
Thank you, Oscar. Thank you so much. Very insightful input again. Of course, we do need to care and facilitate our people, and we have to engage with them and integrate them, into our planning processes. And what's also required is building the participatory competence of these, multiple stakeholders. With this, I would like to draw in Mr. Vaidya again back into the conversation. So my next question to you is about institutionalizing the urban data ecosystem in our cities. The future of urban governance is data-driven, and cities are beginning to adopt this change in their functioning. Bringing the data in focus ensures a move towards outcome-based planning and governance. What actions can be taken to institutionalize the data ecosystem? So over to you.
Again, thank you. I think a lot of this issues also has been picked up by Sridharan ji and Oscar and in their comments. But I think we all talk about data-driven decision making, and we again talk about embedded. During 2 years we did talk about embedding a data-driven decision making culture within our cities, it looks nice to talk about, but how do you really go about it? And I think that's the challenge which we need to really. And my first thing, which I think is missing in our whole data-driven governance, is the communication. I think, how do you communicate not only to the cities, but also to the citizens, the benefit of data-driven approaches? I think that is one area where we need to really work, because, one of the things which really talked up during the COVID thing was the communication of cities, different ways of really saving themselves, working on things. I think communication became a much important, and communication in a language which citizens understand. Governance is a process where you see a physical change. We might say a lot of things on governance, but of a citizen, if I go out and I see a physical change, that's for me a simplest form of governance. And that is how I communicate with my cities, what type of data I will bring, what type of data they want to see. That has to be one very clear area. And for that to happen, I think we need to have, again, I go with my 5-6 pronged approach, which is we need to create a data governance frameworks, define the roles and responsibilities, what type of data management they have to look at it. It need to really come up with the data collection strategies, storage strategies, sharing strategies, privacy strategies, security and quality of data standards has to be really worked out. For that to happen, we definitely need a lot of data infrastructure. It's a very easy, but type of hardware, type of software, type of network capacities which cities require need to be really thought of, so that we have a much better data standards and data integrations, because otherwise it will be a garbage in and garbage out. How do you really make those standards and the quality inputs to make sure that data is become a more shareable and usable in things? So we also need to look at the data quality issues and how you will look at the accuracy, reliability of that data which is coming up. So that there has to be a data audits, and for that to happen, you need to have a very clear formats, definitions, and also looking at what is the consistency of this data and how do. And it's not easy, for this all to be happen, you need a skill sets at the local level. And do we have that type of a manpower? Do we have that type of skill sets? And I think that question goes then back to the planners which we are producing in our country, because which type of, are we really producing enough manpower which really see a career in the urban local bodies. And if they start seeing a career in urban local bodies, and we equip the urban local bodies with the appropriate skills and appropriate staff to analyze and interpret data, so that cities become not only data literate, but start moving towards the data driven decision making process. I think these are the elements. And again, nobody has an answer to all of that. It has to come through collaboration, through networking, through coalitions, through understanding different work weather. And so that's what I said. While we are talking about networking, and this session is one of the networking session, I think the challenge is how do we make these networks more agile? How do they work these networks more contributing to look at it, and what type of macro data analysis which we require at a city level. Expectations from the city are too high. But to manage those expectations, the investments which we are making at the city level are not conducive to that. So how do you really bring more investments to this new thinking, which we need to really push forward, is a challenge which we all need to really create. This data ecosystem or enabling evidence-based decision-making system has to be thought of, and that's where I stop here and see if my co-panelists have further to add on to this. Thank you.
Thank you for your response, sir, and explaining the roadmap to institutionalizing the data ecosystem. Data, I believe, is the new oil and is critical for setting, and we need to focus on not just the data collation and updation, but also building capacities about how this data is used to enable multi-sectoral integration. With this, I would like to invite Rajit to join the conversation. Rajit, just briefly about what your thoughts are on the need for innovation in urban governance structures.
Thank you, Sarika. Thank you, Hitesh, and thank you, NIU as well for this session. Listening to all, the panelists, I mean, it's clear that there are so many roles we need, through urban planning and governance. We want our data right, economic development. We're talking about multiple, SPVs, committees, what are their exit routes. We're talking about all of this coming together. And I think it's important to note that government need not do everything. So government has to play the role of a facilitator. And that's an important part of, hybrid planning and governance as well. For example, when you look at New York, and I'll be brief about this, but if you look at the city of New York, one of the most competitive cities in the world, the Economic Development Corporation of New York is a not-for-profit. The Regional Planning Association of New York is a not-for-profit. So these are non-state actors, and there's no other regional planning authority that sits, on the tri-state region. So there are a number of non-state actors who can also come in to contribute to the way cities are planned and governed. However, while we do that, and they can help, you need multiple partners to, sort of respond to new realities, new challenges, COVID, like you need partners to do this. However, what are you negotiating on? What are you agreeing on? Are you all working towards the same outcomes? Is the crux of ensuring hybrid planning and governance can work. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajit. Your point is very well taken that the government needs to play the role of a facilitator, and we do have to give more power to the non-state actors, if we are wanting some kind of a change and innovation in the urban governance structures. My next question to you again, Rajit, is we are now going to shift our discussion to the sub-theme number 2, which is about shifting from regulatory to strategic planning. So many of our cities, we are, adopting integrated, innovative strategies and which are more strategic in nature and less regulatory and more outcome-based. These frameworks are believed to be less prescriptive and allow greater flexibility of compatible uses to mix with each other rather than these segregated, single use land use zones or functions. So what are the factors that are necessitating this shift in our approach to planning our cities? Is this an either or choice between these two approaches to urban planning? Are these two approaches necessarily exclusive? Over to you, Rijit.
Thank you, Sarika. And that's a good point to start on because, strategic planning is an interesting new way of thinking, which, for example, at WRI where I work, we've been trying to look at this for about 10 years now. How do we get, Indian cities to be able to be more strategic in their thinking? It is not an either or, in my opinion, and it is incorrect to view it as an either or approach. Both play very different roles in the city, strategic planning as well as regulatory, your land use plans. Now, when we understand that they play two different roles, what does the land use plan do? The land use master plans and the development control regulations give you a certain legal certainty to the city. You at least know, your investment in a particular piece of land is not going to go down the drain. You need that clarity and that surety. Similarly, if you need to preserve certain ecological features, say valleys, drains, water bodies, you need a particular protection for it, say through land use. If you need priority on a certain corridor, say through transit-oriented development, it comes through the land use plan. So some of these, land use plans don't need to change every day. They're largely policy documents. However, you also need to be strategic. Like, all of our esteemed colleagues have been speaking about, we're talking about economic development, we're talking about transportation planning coming in, data integration. So there are so many layers we want, cities to do. So you cannot expect your master plan to be a master of everything. That is where we are failing. We are trying to give that designation to the master plan that it is the master of the city, and that is where we fail. So that's, something that we really need to move out of. The strategic plan is really where your visioning comes in. Now, we must understand if our master plans are revised once in 10 years or once in 20 years in many cities and states, it's clearly the officer who's looking at land use plans is pretty much a sanctioning officer. He's looking at your building, looking at violation, in fact, focusing excessively on it, like you violated this much, this is your fine, this is your fee. And suddenly overnight you say, now can you imagine your city for the next 20 years? It is not their role. It is not their thinking. They are geared in a very different way. So strategic thinking has to come in to vision your city. How do you make certain interventions? So another thing about being strategic in a strategic exercise is to choose certain priorities over the others. You can't do everything. You have a limited amount of money, resource, manpower, everything. So what are those choices you're making for your city? How to be strategic about it, how to choose those that give maximum impact, especially projects. So strategic projects is a great way to realize strategic planning. So that's another aspect that we need to consider. We move hence from being a politically influenced plan, master plans are very often influenced politically, to being a politically led plan. So strategic plans, at least in international context, are very often led by mayors. We can figure out what works in our context. We don't have to have, the same system. But what are we moving towards? Like I said, outcome based. What is the outcomes we want? Through the strategic planning exercise is quite critical, and it means choosing certain priorities over the other. Now, interestingly, nothing stops us from doing strategic planning in a context like India. For example, it's all about negotiating between departments, whether it's your industries area development board, your development authority, your municipal corporation, your electricity boards, your water supply boards, your transport corporations. They all need to come together. That is strategic planning. You come together, you agree, you negotiate. If required, you do it off the records, right? You do it off the records because there will be a lot of negotiation that happens. Once you agree on a set of steps on what are the priorities, what will we go with and not. For example, if we choose a certain alignment for a metro rail, can all of the other agencies also join in to say, this is the alignment of the metro rail. I will ensure from the land use point of view, you get higher densities along the corridor. From the water supply, sewage, drainage and electricity board, we say, okay, you will have higher requirements here. We'll give you that extra trunk infrastructure. So this is strategic. Everybody comes in to make this line work, this particular metro line. So this is what we need. And this is not prevented by legislation. we have seen some of it happen in cities. For example, the reason I brought up metro rail is in Bangalore, they've set up a coordination committee around the metro rail. It is a very large investment. You're putting in about 6 billion rupees of investment in a state like Bangalore on metro rail. So they are able to converge to get this going. Can they do it across projects, across planning, across all kinds of projects, not just the metro rail? So I think that's something interesting. And yeah, and then that can then move into the statutory land use plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajit. Very insightful, again, your input. I completely agree that there is a need for a regulatory plan and we cannot overrule that. They have their own advantages about, let's say, setting the rules of the game. However, we do have to also bring in strategic thinking into our planning, which will help us envisioning, setting, prioritizing our strategies or actions that will have maximum impact. And also because there is paucity of resources in our cities. So we really need to prioritize our actions, and we have to prioritize those actions which will create a ripple effect and perhaps act as a catalyst to, for more advantages to the city. Thank you very much. Now I bring in Dr. Sridharan. Sir, in the past, I've had the opportunity to hear you talk about focusing our development efforts in terms of planning, investment, etc., on tier 2 and tier 3 cities, rather than just on the large urban centers. As we discuss this shift from regulatory to strategic urban planning framework, is this shift related to the scale of the urban center? Is the regulatory framework, I understand it's not an either or situation, but let's say that are our smaller urban centers more suitable for regulatory frameworks, and are our larger urban centers with more mature markets feel the need of the shift towards adopting strategic planning approaches more strongly?
Okay, thank you, Sarika. Some issues which I want to link it up with what Hitesh has pointed out, as well as the previous speaker, Ms. Vaidya, also talked about some of the things. I'll start off with that and then issue that. One is in terms of data. Urban data itself is a big issue here. I've been talking about SDI, because once you talk about the SDI, where it came from in terms of small towns and medium towns and census towns, especially. When I was dealing with that, especially with the peri-urban area, as well as with the other part of the regional prospects in terms of how it is being developed in other countries as well as here. With the Ministry of Panchayati Raj, with the Ministry of Rural Development, with the Urban Mission, and with this, what we call it as Swamitwa. Now, you'll be surprised within 1.5 years, in a place like Uttar Pradesh, in a place like Madhya Pradesh, in a place like other thing, almost like 1 lakh villages have been digitalized. Okay, that's surprising, even through that 500 GIS information system which we have for the centers. They are not able to monitor it regularly. Whereas in these cases, even the titling, everything is done in the case of the rural areas, especially in the peri-urban areas, which we are now coming out with a model act. Now, what I'm trying to say is nothing impossible. It is possible, provided there is a commitment from the various organizations in which we can scale it up and scale it down. Okay, that's what we're talking about, smaller towns. The smaller towns, I'll talk with, to start with this census town. There are variation is almost from 20,000, even less than that. If we can say 5,002, it goes up to almost 1,100,000 population. Now we are applying that in terms of land use planning for that. From the center, we're coming out with a model for that. Now, which means it is possible to come out with a smart city, small or medium-sized towns also. We can do this through this. Now, phase 2 of this GIS-based master plan also extend to the, which is not 100,000, but 10,000 kind of a thing also. They are bringing into other small towns also to bring it in terms of GIS-based one, which is possible. Now, the second dimension of it, which I want to cover, the regional act, the PRAC, which come out with a strategic planning. right from 1985 onwards, we have been talking about the urban strategy for each state. Even now, except for few states like Kerala, they came out with this strategy, urban strategy for development. Okay. Some of them have the act, like Maharashtra has an act, Regional Planning Act, and then came out with what is it? The latest one is in 2022, in which I was part of that in terms of coming out which region, which city, which one, small town, medium town, and a big town can be come out even in Nanded and other places, Osmanabad and other places. Similarly, in Tamil Nadu, they came out with Coimbatore, and one is a major one, metropolitan, but they also talk about small in Satyamangalam and other places. So the act has been amended in these places to bring in the regional to the metropolitan to the lowest level. In fact, you'll be knowing that Tamil Nadu has now come out with an urban strategy for developing the smaller towns also throughout. Just last month, they came out with this. So what I'm trying to say, it's possible, like Amsterdam, like Paris and London, we also is possible come out with this policy in terms of urban strategy first, in terms of developing the small towns and medium towns, because it's nothing new. National Commission on Urbanization, which it is there in NIUA, which I've been asking for many years to digitalize it. That is the only place where I get that National Commission on Urbanization, almost 32 reports, okay, which has which has started about the small towns, medium towns, and also the corridors. Now, whatever is happening today is coming from that National Commission on Urbanization. They have already identified that. It's all coming up now with the added of census towns to the small towns and other things. So that again, I go back to that issue. Let's not freeze the master plan. Regulation is important. Freezing it is really a problem, but how to come out with a strategy of master plan itself? Okay, one. The second part is in terms of scenario building. Okay, I'll talk about scenario building because when we went into the villages, even the peri-urban areas, they are not aware of, they know about it, something like an election. Today, okay, I'm getting some benefit, that's it. They are not talking about 5 years, what is the impact of that? Similarly, the master plan talk about 20 years, but in between what happens? How do we tweak the thing in terms of the economic dynamics which is happening? We learned that regulation is also important because even in the stock market also we saw after the Mehta brothers, we talked about that, okay, we are not able to achieve and mature ourselves in terms of stock market. Same thing in the master plan also, we should be thinking in terms of the using the regulator only for that purpose, but otherwise we have to use it strategically, what they did in the metropolitan cities, like what she's talked about New York or Amsterdam or Paris or London, and also go for the in terms of co-governance, that is important, which is possible in terms of scaling down is possible. Because we tried to do that in the terms of Coimbatore along with the Germans. We did that from the micro level, which is the village level, to that of the metropolitan area level, how we can scale it down and scale it up in terms of land use planning and also in terms of economic inputs. That's something very important because that's all, again, I go back to that engines are very important in the development process. Okay, that's why I stop here and then I'll go back later on. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for emphasizing on the need for urban strategy at a state level for developing the small and medium towns, the economic corridors, and also emphasizing on the fact that our master plans need to be more dynamic, leaving the scope open for interim changes to the plan if required. I would now want to direct my next question to Oscar. Oscar, we all understand that economy is the foundation for sustainable urbanization. So how can strategic planning help in preserving, expanding, and diversifying the existing economic base of our cities? Over to you, Oscar.
Thank you so much for these tricky questions because it's not an easy to answer question, but that's why it's interesting in itself. No, at the same time, I think that it's important to keep in mind this. At the beginning, I think we are trying to. Let me back to one of your first question that you mentioned, if there is a need to choose between regulatory or strategic planning, and I totally agree with you that it's not a matter of if we have to choose yes or not. I mean, they are all together to understand the diversity, and I'm going through your last question exactly to my question specifically. that we need both in order to bring together all the stakeholders in a city, in an urban area, to understand what are the potential, the abilities, to what can they share for the city, for the territory, to bring together different people, different investments on the territory. That's why the strategic planning is very interesting to bring together, to understand, to have a larger view of what is happening in the urban area. The regulatory perspective give you a street level approach. I mean, landing, but it's critical to give some coherence to the strategic plan. So the strategic plan, why is it important for the cities? Because it helps you to see what can I do and what can I do with the assets that I have in the territory. That's very important to understand that this is what the business are looking for. Some kind of flexibility, and you get flexibility when you have a more or less detailed knowledge of what is happening in your territory. And to have a more or less better knowledge of the territory, you need data. That is something that this critical word that has been appeared during all this conversation is the data that is critical to implement both regulatory and strategic. So I think that probably this tricky question from our side, from the metropolitan perspective, has a very easy, in a way, answer, in terms that the strategic planning gives to the business the flexibility that they need, the flexibility to an uncertain times that we are living. I mean, we are living in a time that everything is changing all the time. This is the only constant matter. The only constant in the times that we are living is the change. And if we don't mix the strategic and the regulatory perspective, and in a broad, in a 13-feet perspective, but also at the street level, we are having problems both in terms of sustainability, in terms of inclusion, in terms of economic development. So it's important to mix all of them, because what the people and the business are looking for is the stability that give you the regulatory, and the perspective in the long term that give you the strategic perspective. So the mix of both of them is what is the business about. So probably the answer to your first question, to the main question, is very simplistic. Is what the people, what the business are looking for is this flexibility. But it's also at the same time a very complex goal for the cities. I would like to remark the importance of data in all this process. For a matter of example, right now we are analyzing the metropolitan realities in Europe, and everybody in our team understood that, okay, Europe, we have a lot of data, we can compare what is happening all across Europe between Helsinki and Barcelona and Torino, all these cities. But what we have found, that we have in Europe a problem of data. So it's a problem that we have a lot of data, but probably we are not having a strategic and a regulatory perspective in using this data, in collecting this data. And that makes you difficult to have a broader, more interesting and goal-oriented perspective. So thank you so much. I think that that's my contribution to this debate on this.
Thank you, Oscar. Take your point very well, that we need to have a combination of both regulatory and strategic planning. As was told by Virijit also, it's not a matter of either or. And what the advantage that strategic planning offers is that it allows the market forces to actually decide, in which direction the cities need to go, whether the economic base of the city would would expand and diversify in which direction, and which parts of it would be preserved. So with this, I would want Hitesh sir to please come in. Mr. Vaidya, a short comment from your side, based on the discussion that we just heard.
I think this was quite enriching discussion, and I particularly think that there is no magic recipe for answering, and I think this is by learning, co-learning, and relearning a lot of things. We don't have any even core mantra that can change the solution. But I think that whatever I heard, I think the key ingredients, if I have to really say for change, towards the improving our policy process, or trying to move towards the job creation, social inclusion, climate, all three of them together in the planning process, I think we need to definitely, all of them have panelists have really, through their expertise opinion, have talked about, we definitely need to have appropriate policies, appropriate rules and regulations. That's the key to all of them. Secondly, fostering integrated planning mechanism has to be linked with the infrastructure and services together. It cannot be just a planning, but how do you interlink with the services and infrastructure? Third, everybody talked about how do you create those financial strategies to manage and sustain urbanization process and urban development. And also, I think the area was about how do you bring more citizen-centric approaches to align the development agenda with the priorities. So I think these five areas definitely need to really work on if we have to really talk about paradigm shift, which we have been talking about for last 2 years. I think we need to revisit some of these areas and how we bring planning into a more focus, because I think the planning becomes the starting point for all the, whether it's economic development, sustainable development, whatever words we are in. But I think somebody as a panelist also pointed out, it's planning has to be much more citizen oriented, and citizens should see a value in it. And that's the one area where we need to really see that, while we are doing the whole process of planning, need to be seen as a value add rather than just another land use planning. So whatever words we might use, it has to really link back to the people. And I think that has been the key message of all the discussion. If I have a one great takeaway from this Manthan here. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for summarizing the inputs provided by our panelists. We'll now move to the third topic of our third sub-theme of our discussion today, which is about redevelopment or some people also use the word regeneration of the brownfields of our cities. Now we know that the regeneration of brownfields would play a very essential, critical role in ensuring the sustainability of our urban areas. And why the need for redevelopment has emerged, because the pressure of urbanization is there, land dynamics play a role, there are vulnerability impacts, and there is a need for providing better access to civic amenities, opportunities, etc. Within our cities. The uptake of regeneration projects, however, is high in countries where the government is the major landowner, like say, for instance, in Singapore, where the government owns on more than 80% of the land. My next question is regarding this to you, Rajit, that what are the strategies that countries like ours can adopt to propel regeneration where land is privately owned and regeneration is privately funded? Over to you, Rajit.
Thank you, Sarika. And since you mentioned, countries like ours, so, as we know, we are now the most populous country in the world. The region in which you and I sit in, the Delhi agglomeration, is also going to be the largest agglomeration in the world. So clearly, there are no more planning frameworks we can borrow and look at, but we have to now be more inventive to imagine, how to handle our cities, etc. But I think the bigger problem that we are seeing in our cities is they are starting to hollow out. The whole need for regeneration, as you're talking about, whether it is Delhi, and we've done very detailed study of the Delhi NCR and its economic geography, and we've understood what are these processes. It's not just hollowing out, it's jobs moving out, jobs preferring larger parcels on the peripheries, people moving following the jobs, or vice versa. So there is a lot happening, whether it is Mumbai, Bangalore, Delhi. There is a hollowing out that's starting in cities. And what is this push? So I would actually say it is not necessary that it has to be government-owned land to ensure redevelopment. In fact, one of the cities that's actually redeveloping on its own is Mumbai. And there's a reason for that. Mumbai, I've lived for a few years in Mumbai and then moved to Delhi, but every time I go back, that place has changed in terms of redevelopment, much taller buildings. It's the only sort of vertical city we have in India as of now, compared to all of our other cities. And that also relates to policies that have come over time. And I'll give you an example of, say Delhi, for example, right? When we studied the economic geography also, over time, whether it is the 1962 master plan of Delhi, whether it is the current plans, there are so many pushes to decentralize Delhi. Now it's understandable to decentralize if there are certain, highly polluting, high land consumption, very low value production, these kind of establishments can be pushed out. But when you push out, you should also think, what should you bring back in? And that has been sort of the failure of most of our cities and plans. So for example, in Delhi, they would never let you move beyond a mono use, in terms of industrial land use. You had to bring in a similar industry back to that same place. But you have to be more responsive to the market. It requires a very different kind of use, a different kind of mix. And that was not allowed for a lot of time. So land became scarce in Delhi because of these reasons. And hence the peripheries, what we found is, whether it is the Gurgaon and Faridabad or the Noida, all of them have taken advantage of this, right? As peripheries, they've taken advantage of this. They've invested, they've taken on all of the FDI that's coming in, put up, for example, say a cyber city, which could have come into Delhi. The land was there in Delhi. So these kind of moves have to be thought out. When you're pushing something out, what should replace it? And how do you facilitate that through regulations and your plans? So I think that's one miss that we've done in most of our cities. Bangalore is very similar. They were actually trying to do a Mumbai in a sense where they give lower densities in terms of FSI in the core and higher FSI in the periphery. If you give me that option, I will never come and redevelop in the core because the land is anyway more expensive and infrastructure provision levels are very high in cores. For example, there are 4 or 5 lines of metro crisscrossing in the heart of the city, whether it's Bangalore, whether it's Delhi. It's very expensive land. So if you give me the option of going to the periphery, I will not come into the core. So how do you, sort of ensure people are coming back into the core rather than opening up your peripheries indefinitely? So I think that's strategy number 1, to figure out how to regenerate your cores. Then, like I've said, where we've seen it happen, say, for example, in Mumbai, there's also a publication we did a while ago called State-Led Alternative Mechanisms to Acquire Plan and Service Land. So this was both for inner city as well as, peripheries, like say for example, the land pooling schemes. But we also looked at core cities. And some of the most, working mechanisms, I won't say excellent, but working are largely in Mumbai. They have the accommodation reservation, and which is basically accommodation reservation and TDR based redevelopment. There's cluster redevelopment schemes. All of this, we've documented and done it through imagery as well, where it's a matter of giving incentives. What is the incentive you're giving? What is the amount of sale component you're allowing a developer to come and take that land? At the same time, give out, say, an extra road that needed to be cut into that parcel, an open space in a dense area, versus their sale component and rehabilitation component. So these are methods and incentives that can be looked at. At the same time, you mentioned, sort of the equity parts. What about Mumbai's population is almost 50% slum. So how do you look at in situ redevelopment so that, people are not displaced, but housed? So, you need the social schemes as well, and not just the, highly remunerative ones. How can you look at self reconstruction through community, leveraging? So there are many ways to do it. I would not say it has to be government owned, but you have to government should provide the right incentives and facilitate the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Rijit. I just would like to summarize what you said. The need for a strategy to regenerate our cores, we have to focus on that. We also need to, provide incentives for regeneration to take off in our cities. So this could be in form of, FAR incentives, TDR, accommodation reservation, etc. Multiple tools are available. and contextually, these could be adopted by the cities. One very important point is about ensuring equity while undertaking regeneration. And, there is a question which I will be asking later on about ensuring that gentrification does not take place as an outcome of regeneration. Thank you, Rajeev. Dr. Sridharan, my next question is to you. I request you to throw some light on the ways, the ways that the role performed by the private sector, being an integral part of urban regeneration process in terms of stimulating the property development and investment. The use of capital within regeneration raises the question of access to and availability of finance. And indeed, the more extensive the scale of development, the greater the dependence on private investment. However, from the private sector perspective, there is a perception that urban regeneration projects are risky. And here I'm not talking about plot level regeneration. I'm talking about an integrated planning, and a regeneration of a larger scale. So what strategies can be adopted by the local government or authorities to increase the private sector participation in urban regeneration and offering some kind of an assurance to them? Over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. A few dimensions of this whole thing. I start off with that. Why you talk about this? I mean, why we discuss about this regeneration? Because initially they were talking about industries in the core of the city or housing in the core of the city. Okay. Then because of the population and everything, that's a whole issue came up on this one. Second thing is the most important is pollution. Okay. Now, in the case of, let us say, we have invested heavily to the private sector in terms of industries initially, right from 1956 onwards. If we talk about Mumbai, textile industries, or even in the chemicals, in the case of Delhi or Kanpur, all these industries has been invested. They're all private, there is not public. All these things which came up in terms of regeneration, maybe in Mumbai's Phoenix, or here in the Hindustan Levers in Delhi, or many in Kanpur, all the things, the governance is the main issue. The governance came up to the government, the legal issue, and the judiciary has to come in and then say that now the equity has to be brought in. They converted the whole thing in terms of land use, in terms of residential land use, out of which certain percentage has to be given to the poor. Okay. Now, out of which they got the benefit, the private got the benefit from the industry as well as from the government in terms of investment incentives. They're not an issue. Only certain portion, because they got the land value captured, they did that because it was from the core. Okay, so this has already been there in the regulations and everything. You have had a DDA had a fight and the MMBRDA had a fight and all the thing. Finally, the legally issue had to brought in. That is one. The second, how to bring in the regeneration done. So the best example for Shahjahanabad. Now, after the metro came in, I went into many of the entrepreneurs there. Now, they don't reside there. They are in Gurgaon, they are in somewhere else. Why that Gurgaon and elsewhere also? Because of the expansion. Business expansion or the economic engines have been shifted because of the Land Ceiling Act. We have to understand, because it came from 1976, why it has expanded, Delhi has expanded, is because of Land Ceiling Act. Whereas Haryana never had that facility. In Gurgaon, there was a small town at the time. So similar in the case of Mumbai, the Land Ceiling Act was the main thing behind this expansion, which like a spanner, and it went into other cities, other states to spill over to this, all this aspect. One. The second is, what is missing out is in this, how to take care of this, the private sector. It's important to have the private sector, as I said initially, as a co-governance system. As a stakeholder, they should be very important. At the same time, why don't we develop this particular thing? So we have been talking about from the government, from the state government, as well as from the central government for other things. We talk about heritage. Yesterday, I was just discussing about it. Okay, have we made this Dharavi as a living heritage and develop it in terms of infrastructure and provide these things? Have we invested heavily? That's where it's important to have how the shift in the funding has to be done for this kind of regeneration. Okay, it's not developing only those things. Okay, we want to develop some other thing, because finally what happened in the legal system comes into the picture for governance. And then they say, do you have to provide this? Instead of do that together in terms of living heritage areas, and then develop it different areas which are what you call the regenerated areas, and then develop it through the funding through the private in terms of co-governance, and then share it with them. Even for that, we can shift some of the funding from these areas, big cities in big funding, to that of small and medium towns, so that there is no pressure is given on the big cities. Okay, that's possible through amending the CFC, that's Central Finance Commission and the State Finance Commission, and relook into that needs to in terms of how much can be given to regenerated areas, how can be given to the small and medium towns, so that they don't come into those areas which we have to pressurize upon in terms of funding. Okay, it is possible to do it, but yes, as I said, there are many stakeholders in it. Incentivization, we have been doing it. It's not necessary that we have to go back, because it's like a subsidy system which existed right from 1956 onwards. If we continue with that, it's going to have much of a problem for them. Say in the case of TDR, see how they captured it themselves in terms of private sector. Only thing is you have to incentivize, and not in terms of money, but in terms of the rules and regulations to liberalize them in sort of the thing. So that's where the spatial governance will come in the regenerated areas to capture that land value capture. That is something very, very important in this particular aspect. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We've already exceeded the time limit for this Manthan by 15 minutes. So I'm now going to keep it request you all to keep your responses slightly short. Sir, very well emphasized on some very critical aspects that private sector is a very important stakeholder, and there is a need for a co-governance structure. And when we talk about incentives, they need not necessarily be monetary incentives only, but also spatial incentives. With this, Oscar, my next question is to you, that what are the advantages of undertaking strategic regeneration in a city? For example, something that is propagated by the urban renaissance policy of Japan. And what are the enabling strategies and actions that can be taken by local governments to attract investments into specific areas where they want to undertake urban regeneration, specific locations? Thanks, Oscar. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I think that like in this question, I'd like two main items: the advantage and what can the cities do to attract investment. Regarding the advantage, I think that they are more or less mentioned previously. One that I didn't have that I would like to highlight is the heritage. No, I think that it's important to keep in mind that this is an thing that the city, an asset that the city has, and that is important for the people. I mean, we cannot forget that we are talking here about better improving the people's quality of life in our cities, and this kind of urban reference are critical and important for the citizens, for the people in the cities. We need to maintain these kind of things. If we only address to make the profit of the territory as bigger and bigger and bigger, we are wasting the opportunity to tell a story for the citizens and for the people. So it's important to keep in mind these kind of intangible things that, such as heritage. I have on my list of advantage something that is more or less easy to reach, but it's critical, and it's important to keep in mind all the time, that is regarding the sustainability, no? And with the land that we are having is the land that only have. I mean, we cannot expand forever. The sprawl is a big issue for every city in the world, but it's not only a matter of sustainability, it's also a matter of business. I mean, what the cities are doing to give transportation, to give water, to give wealth, to give Wi-Fi to these areas. I mean, it's a matter of business. And let's try to think in that perspective, that the sprawl gives you a lot of money to introduce to the city in the form of taxes and to invest in other places. But probably the trade-off is not positive for the city itself in the long term. So it's important for the matter of sustainability, but not only from the perspective of nature and climate change and this kind of thing that is already affecting us. But it's also a matter of business for the city itself. So it's important to keep in mind this. Regarding what can cities do to bring investment to these sectors, one of the things that we have found in worldwide in different cities is political leadership. I mean, and the political leadership is not a matter of how many votes you get from the last election. It's a matter of clear vision of where the city is heading. I mean, it's important to keep in mind that political leadership is critical to implement any kind of project, especially when you are trying to attract investors. I mean, you don't have a strong, clear, but also a democratic and inclusive perspective of the city, probably you will have problems to bring to the investors. I think this element of political leadership is important not only in times of emergencies, as we find during the COVID, but also in times of opportunities that probably we are having in the next few years. This leadership is important. Another element in Barcelona, where I am living now, we are having a deep transformation of the city, probably one of the biggest that I have seen in 20 or 30 years here in the city. And the policy leadership that is implementing these changes has a lot of forces against her to implement these kind of things, all from the political, but also from the economical. The numbers, when you go to the data and see that this regeneration process is clear, that is important and brings to the city better quality of life for the people, but also more money for the city without expanding the city through all the territory. So it's important to maintain this equilibrium to do that. And going back to the previous question, to have this strong political leadership, we need a synchronized regulatory and strategic planning perspective. I think altogether, data planning perspective, regulatory and political leadership give us the opportunity to attract investors, not only to the specific projects, but to attract and retain the talent needed to bring more money to the city. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Oscar. I now request Mr. Vaidya to summarize the discussion on regeneration, and also if he could briefly tell us about the regeneration strategies or the approach that has been adopted by the draft master plan of Delhi 2041, and which NIUA supported in its formulation. So over to you.
Thank you again. And I think looking at the time frame and the area, I will just say that, I'll try to summarize the regeneration as well as because I think both Sridharan sir as well as Jijita and Oscar and really brought out a very clear thinking is that cities cannot be looked at from single lens. There are different typologies of cities. Every cities have a different planning process required for every different city. You cannot have single planning process. And I think the overall picture which came up during the discussion, and I think I'll just summarize that is regular land use planning is not the only tool available with the city. So we need to really move out of the land use planning to a more strategic planning, and we need to come up with the new planning frameworks or instruments to address new and varied needs of the cities. And I think urban regeneration, economic planning, ecology definitely are the key aspects. And I think during the master plan of Delhi, which your answer, and even though it's a long subject and I'll not venture it, but I think it's the first time that master plan of Delhi did talk about a regeneration plan and as a spatial strategy of a draft MPD 2041, which talked about enabling redevelopment of older built fabric and demand of social infrastructure in dense areas, as well as foster walkable and mixed-use neighborhoods. So everything has been talked about, and I think both Rijit and Sridharan sir did talk about those issues. My only thing is that while we are talking about regeneration at the low income level or a low neighborhood level, it should not lead to a gentrification. So we need to really be very conscious of that exercise and see how we can really use the proper policy frameworks and the instruments which are available, so it becomes a much more economically viable and regenerating actually in the real sense. So that's where I'll stop here. But I think it has been a great learning curve during these things, and I think these aspects which all of the panelists brought out need to be really thought about while we are moving towards the new thinking. And how do we, the challenge, which is, I think somebody said, we are expecting too much from the master plan, and master plan cannot be the answer for all our issues. And the plan, it requires a larger thinking. It also talks about the role of planning in the city itself, and how the planning becomes a one point to really influence a lot of decisions. So it brings up a lot of governance issues rather than on the planning issues. I think those need to be really thought of, because it varies, and we need to really be, as earlier also pointed out, how we make these instruments more dynamic, more strategic, more real-time basis, and under all, more usable friendly. And I think we as a planners have also complicated a lot of issues, and we need to really point out a lot of fingers, because we have made the language of planning too complicated. And I think that need to be simplified as much as possible. Thank you. I again, on behalf of NIUA, I take this opportunity to thank all the panelists joining here. Over to you.
We've got a couple of questions. Just very briefly, I would request the panelists to keep their responses very brief. One of them is, sir, for Hitesh, sir. I think, we'll take the question for Rajit first. Rajit, the question is, who in your opinion should lead the strategic planning unit? How do we institutionalize this? Mumbai had formed a Mumbai Transformation Urban Unit, which was similar and led by the CM of Maharashtra, so politically led. So who, in your opinion, should lead the strategic planning unit that you mentioned?
Right. So I think, the moment you talk about cities like a Mumbai or a Bangalore, which are really the cash cows of the entire state, there are too many stakeholders that come into the city. We had assisted a Bangalore restructuring committee a few years ago, where they were trying to understand how to, rethink the municipal corporation, figure out planning, coordination. It was very clear with the number of parastatals you have in a city, water supply, electricity, all of them are state departments in the city. Industry area development board, etc. So a city leader will not be able to, go over state departments. Like a city municipal commissioner cannot manage it. In those cases, it looked like the chief minister was the right person. In terms of the political leadership, and in terms of the administrative leadership, it needed to be at a chief secretary or a principal secretary level to manage the cooperation for big cities. Smaller cities, I think it can be different. It won't be as fought over as the big cities.
Thanks, Rajit. Hitesh, sir, just one question to you. Many cities are now having directly elected mayors. Do you think that they are more effective compared to the indirectly elected mayors, or it doesn't matter?
I really think it doesn't matter. It's more, what matters is how empowered the mayoral system is, how much who owns the city, and mayor of the city is empowered enough to make those decisions. Whether it comes from directly or indirectly is not. And I think the empowerment of urban local body and the role of a mayor in delivering that thinking, because he is the first citizen of a city, whichever route he comes from, and that's where we need to have Empowered urban local bodies led by the mayor is what is the most important aspect at this moment of time. That's what I particularly think here. Because if we really want to move from this full accidental efficiencies approach to institutional efficiencies approach, I think we need to empower our urban local bodies, and empowered mayor becomes much more important.
Okay, thank you for the response, sir. Just one last question to Dr. Sridharan. How can we empower the consultants hired in governance and planning instead of just having advisory roles?
That needs a lot of amendments in terms of act and other things. Still, they have to be in terms of advisory role itself. Because see, what is important is the technical aspect of it. It's not the technical aspect is as Hitesh just now pointed out. The empowerment has to be done and the capacity building has to be done in terms of politicians, in terms of the people who are in the thing. We are just a facilitator to develop, facilitator in terms of planning, in terms of implementation. That's all. But actually, it has to be taken over by the people themselves. Okay, we are also part of the system. So we have to advise them and then come about it. It's not that I know we can do everything. No, it's not possible. Okay, we have to accept that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. As the moderator of this session, I would just want to thank all the panelists, Mr. Vaidya, Dr. Sridharan, Rajit, and Oscar, who had to unfortunately leave us because it's our fault we exceeded the time too much. But anyway, this topic is just too engaging to conclude in 1 hour's time. I would just again also want to extend my thanks to my colleagues who've supported in organizing this Manthan. We have Saryu and we have Kapil and also Nimisha. Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks to NIUA and also to Sarika, Hitesh, and the whole team. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oscar.